Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Richard Blake, a psychologist specializing in breathwork, plant medicine, biohacking, and mental health. Dr. Blake has conducted extensive research on conscious connected breathwork, leading the largest randomized control trial in this field, and that's what we'll go into detail on today. Now, Dr. Blake also co-hosts the RUNGA radio podcast alongside Joseph Anew, who has been on our podcast and hosted a few of our episodes in the past, and we're really excited to have Dr. Blake here to join us for this episode today. So, Richard, it's great to have you. Thanks for calling in and joining us for the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Paul.
So, how do you know Joseph? How did you end up meeting Joseph? Because Joseph has hosted a few of our episodes. He's been our career advisor and program advisor for the Training Institute. He's been certified by our training program, and he's a good friend. How did you and Joseph end up meeting?
Yeah, so I've been a kind of lifelong Ben Greenfield fan, and always wanted to meet him and hang out with him. And then I heard about this RUNGA event where all these sort of elite biohackers get together with a small group and have this sort of 5-star experience that is the RUNGA retreat. And Joseph is the founder of RUNGA, and so I went to one of the events and I had an amazing time, and I had a really good connection with Joseph, and we just stayed in touch and got talking, and we had a lot of crossovers, a lot of similar values and ideas, and ended up just deciding to work together.
And so what excites you about RUNGA in particular? What has you really inspired to join that team and help Joseph and his wife Amelia build what they're building?
Yeah, I think they have a lot of class. I come from the UK where class is a big thing. Class system is everywhere. The US is, abolished that class system. So, it's, some people might, I often see, in social media and things that, I'd say a lack of class, especially in sort of biohackers, selling things and, pushing their claims and talking trash about other people. And I just felt like RUNGA just sort of stayed above that. It sort of, held itself with a level of class that I hadn't seen so much in the biohacking world. And class and integrity, I would say, are two of those key things, and just really high standards, from the food they serve at their events to the practitioners that they bring in to speak. It felt like a level up to everything else.
Now, I've been to a couple RUNGA events myself. I went to one, I believe, in May 2022, and then Joseph hosted one in October 2023. I think that was the last sort of larger public one that they had, and they may be planning another one shortly. And it's a great community. He's the two that I went to were both in Austin. He's been hosting it for some time. And part of what they do is, they have cold plunges, they have, ice baths, they have different biohacking tools that they bring in, but they'll also lead different aspects and elements around breath work. And I think what stuck out most about your background and bio was the research that you've done specifically on conscious connected breathwork. So I'd love to sort of dive into that rabbit hole and start there for the meat of our interview. Let's start first by defining conscious connected breathwork. What is conscious connected breathwork?
Yeah. So conscious connected breathwork is a kind of umbrella term for a load of different schools of breathwork. So holotropic breathwork is probably the most famous type of conscious connected breathwork. There are other fine schools such as breath guru, clarity breathwork, transformational breathwork, and some people, it's a kind of amorphous field, but some people have tried to define it as like therapeutic breath work. So it's really for people who, having mental health issues, or they want to experience expanded states of consciousness, as opposed to something like the oxygen advantage and the Buteyko method, which is more about breathing functionally, breathing optimally for sport, healing dyspnea and other breathing conditions. And then you have more of the historical stuff like the yoga and pranayama, which is obviously comes from the East. And then I would say you also now have the intermittent hypoxic schools, which would be your Wim Hofs and your Soma breath schools, which I also teach, which I would say are more about like vitality, about boosting performance, boosting health, boosting brain function. So yeah, conscious connected breathwork, I would say is it's the most potent, it's the most powerful, but it's also the one that probably requires the most training and the most safeguards around. And this is something I'm involved in a think tank for breathwork to try and raise the standards of conscious connected breathwork, because there are a lot of cowboy breathworkers out there with either weekend certifications or not even a certification at all, doing breathwork ceremonies with 50 clients to one facilitator, and just things getting out of control, people getting re-traumatized, people getting tetany and dissociation, all sorts of terrible things happening. So yeah, because of the potency of CCB, it requires a higher level of training and guardrails.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned holotropic as, let's say, a form of conscious connected breath work. Many of our listeners are familiar with holotropic breathwork. It was quote unquote invented by Stanislav Grof as a way to bring someone into a psychedelic state without the drug itself. He did this after LSD became illegal in the late 60s. And holotropic, I mean, I went to a workshop with Stan maybe 6 years ago in the Bay Area at CIIS. And it was, if I remember correctly, a maybe 90-minute to 2-hour really intense session. And I've also done other forms of conscious connected breathwork that were maybe closer to like an hour or so, that were a little bit more easygoing. Tell us, outside of holotropic, are there other specific forms of conscious connected breathwork, and maybe what are some of the distinctions or differences between these forms of conscious connected breathwork that have that more sort of therapeutic or healing orientation?
Yeah, so I did my PhD at CIIS, so yeah, I had that connection to Stan Grof. So I would say that holotropic breathwork, is pioneering and it's wonderful and it's helped a lot of people. But as with any kind of, sharp blade, as they say, there is the potential for misuse. And as psychotherapy and therapy culture has evolved, people have become more aware of the negative effects that can happen from like that extreme, let's say, pre-trauma informed approach to breath work. So now I would say that breath workers are trained in, good breath workers are trained in trauma, in the dorsal vagal like freeze response as well. That can certainly come up in these altered states. So I'd say, yeah, holotropic is quite aggressive, and for some people, maybe your average psychedelic bro who just loves to get high on their own supply, holotropic is great. But for someone who's dealing with maybe, let's say, trauma, or is much more sensitive and maybe a little bit more timid, holotropic can be completely overwhelming. It can lead to emotional flooding. It can lead to dissociation and quite negative effects, and lasting negative effects as well. So the newer ones like Breath Guru. So I'm a part of the teacher training team at Breath Guru, which is a kind of European-based breathwork teacher training school. We have a psychotherapist, my wife actually, who's a psychotherapist, just about to complete her training, teaching trauma-informed approaches to breathwork and how to spot someone who may be in a trauma response. And, taking people a little bit slower. I think sometimes the approach can be like, just push through, just breathe, shut up, Wim Hof's just breathe, motherfucker. That's great for someone like Wim Hof, but for other people, it can be, scary.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is there's a lot of overlap then between these really deep states that are facilitated through conscious connected breathwork. A lot of overlap with that in psychedelic medicine, and you've talked about being part of this think tank that's really trying to elevate. From a practitioner perspective, these requirements or qualifications to ensure that those who are coming into this state are well held. What would you say are some important principles for facilitators who are exploring or committed to conscious connected breathwork that they need to be familiar with if they really want to get into this space and support clients with this type of work?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about the basics, like you need insurance. If you don't have a certification, you can't get insurance. If you don't do a training, you probably don't know you need insurance. Then I would say things like informed consent. A lot of places, they're not doing informed consent. They don't tell people about the potential risks, which are large for certain populations. And then I would say, the biggest one that everyone seems to roll their eyes at is the ratio of participants to facilitators. So the GBPA, which is they're trying to regulate the industry, Global Breathwork Practitioners Alliance, they say that a 1 to 7 facilitator to client ratio is appropriate. I would say that's quite cautious. And then it kind of gets into the like what's economically viable, because if you're doing 1 to 7, maybe you have to charge people several $100s. Whereas if you go more to 1 to 12 or something like that, maybe you can charge a more like a rate that's more accessible to other people. So there are those kind of trade-offs. One, making it good value for people, and then also making it worth the time of the facilitator, because if they can't make any money from it, it's also, people aren't going to get this breathwork medicine. But I think the most obvious one is like when you see some breathwork bro or chick doing like a session at a festival and they've got 100 people breathing and 50 of them are in tetany, 40 of them have walked out, and then there's 10 people just having a great time, and then they just get the feedback of those 10 people being like, oh, it was amazing, but they don't realize, they don't hear from all the people who left or are in chronic dissociative state. So I'd say obviously money is a big factor there. Greed comes in, ego comes in. People want to say, oh yeah, I held space for 300 people, aren't I? I'm an amazing facilitator, when actually you're probably being quite reckless if you're doing that larger a session.
That's interesting. The 1 to 7 or maybe 1 to 10 to 12. Usually for plant medicine, what we teach in our certification program is 1 to 3 is probably the more cautious lens. And this is very high doses of psilocybin. This isn't just a microdose. This is 3 to 4 to 5 grams. And what we have in ours is more like a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. I think a lot of it has to do with what's the background of the individuals who are coming in. If you have, let's say you're doing a training program and a lot of these people have been vetted on the front end and there's not a lot of quote unquote trauma, or they've already done a lot of work on that and they're really coming in, then you usually don't need as many facilitators if folks have that level of experience. But if you're bringing folks in who are brand new, who have never done this before, who are just maybe starting their journey of personal development or awakening, and you don't have that number of practitioners, it can be very risky. I mean, I won't name names, but there are people that I know who run, for example, really big workshops, and they might have 400 to 500 people in that workshop all doing a very intense form of breath work, and they don't have 30 facilitators on the floor. They might have 5 or 10, and those 5 to 10 co-facilitators aren't necessarily well trained. And like you said, 90% of those people or 95% of those people could have really beautiful and breakthrough experiences, and it could be fantastic. But if you have just 5% of 500 people who are coming out in a disassociated state or re-traumatized, it's just not a good look. It's not actually accretive or helpful in the long term if you're putting that type of risk or integrating that type of risk into the practice that you're facilitating.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that 1 to 3. That sounds very responsible.
Extremely responsible. Yeah, it's important. Okay, let's talk about the research that you do, that you carried out. So you ran the largest ever randomized control trial on conscious connected breathwork. Tell us a little bit about that. What was the hypothesis there? What were you exploring from a research perspective? What were some of the results that you landed on from that research?
Yeah, so the hypothesis was, does conscious connected breathwork, the question was, does conscious connected breathwork reduce symptoms of anxiety in an online environment? So I was, creating that hypothesis during the COVID pandemic. So it had to be online, but also it was quite useful because no research had been done on online breathwork. And during the pandemic, everyone had to go online. So it kind of ticked those boxes as well. There has been has not been a lot of high quality research done on conscious connected breathwork. When I was formulating my study in class, I had to do a literature review, of course, and I had to write about the other studies that had been done. And I gave it to my professor to review, and they're like, where are all the studies? Why hasn't there been any follow up here? You need to work harder. And I was like, no, this is all there is. Like, there's no more. Which is quite confusing because all the research had showed really, really beneficial results. Remission of alcohol dependence in people, healing, increasing immune function in cancer patients. But a lot of these were like really small sample sizes, no follow-ups. So that's why I really wanted to do a randomized control trial. And, in terms of the hierarchy of evidence, that's almost at the top. I had clinically anxious people. So we used the Zung self-rating anxiety scale. And another kind of interesting fact or finding was I had about 400 applicants for my study, and only about 108 actually made it through. And I would say of those, 400 people or 300 people who didn't make it through, the majority of them didn't make it through because they didn't have anxiety. They didn't have clinical levels of anxiety. They thought they had anxiety, but when you actually use a study, the Zung Self-Rating Anxiety Scale, which has a high Cronbach's alpha, which means it measures what it says it's measuring, these people don't actually have anxiety. They've just been led to believe by social media, by their friends, by the regular media that they have a problem and they're anxious. But actually, that's just life. It's just normal to worry at times. Then the study itself. So we did 6 sessions of 90-minute Conscious Connected Breathwork ceremonies led by me online, co-hosted by my wife, Natalia, who's also a breath worker and, about to complete her psychotherapy training. And we tested their anxiety levels at the start. And after 6 weeks of Conscious Connected Breathwork ceremonies, done once weekly. And then we also had the control group, which were basically treatment as usual. We told them the study's full, but we're going to start a second cohort in 6 weeks. So we measured their anxiety at the start of their 6-week waiting list and at the end, and had that as the comparison to the people who went through the Conscious Connected Breathwork ceremonies. And so it was a crossover study. So those people on the wait list, then their results were included once they did another 6 weeks in that second cohort. And we had amazing results. We had statistical significance. We also had a large effect size. So I always often say, like, statistical significance just says whether or not the results were down to chance, but more importantly, the effect size shows how potent this thing really is. And when you compare Conscious Connected Breathwork's large effect size to a meta-analysis of CBT and SSRIs, they both have small effect sizes on anxiety. So a much larger effect size than the two, the gold standard treatment for anxiety. I have to, caveat that by saying we didn't compare directly CCB to SSRIs and CBT, so it's not a real fair comparison. But for context, those are the kind of results you get from those other types of treatments. And the actual results were, the control group's anxiety went down by 1.89 on the Zung Self-Rating Anxiety Scale. So the scale goes up to 80. So 1.89 is nothing effectively, whereas the Conscious Connected Breathwork groups went down 10.5. So wow. a 1,000% increase in anxiety reduction compared to the control group. And we were really pleased with that. The effects were so profound. Like the average anxiety score of the participants at the start was 45. A clinical diagnosis is 35 out of 80. So we took people from an average of 45 down to 34 point something. So effectively, remission of anxiety with 6 weeks of Conscious Connected Breathwork on average.
And that's every day with the Conscious Connected Breathwork.
Yes and no. So we had a covariate where we gave people a 10-minute recording of me teaching or doing a 10-minute session, but they did one 90-minute session per week and then 10 minutes per day. And we asked people at the end, how often did you use the 10-minute recording? And so they could say, I used it every day. I didn't use it any days at all. And we actually found no difference between the people who did it in 0 days and the people who did it every day. So what I hypothesized about that was like, CCB needs longer sessions than 10 minutes to get the effects. That's in my anecdotal experience. I tend to find it's only after about half an hour when people start to have the big emotional shifts, the mystical experiences. So 10 minutes isn't enough to have that kind of effect. You could also say that it was a recording and there was no live practitioner there. So maybe that inhibited the results. You could also say that maybe there's a saturation effect. Maybe 90 minutes gets all the benefits you can from CCB, and then 10 minutes is just not going to move the needle. It's kind of diminishing returns.
So kind of going back to our conversation from earlier, right? This 1-7 or 1-12 facilitator ratio. When you're facilitating or conducting this in an online environment, there must be additional steps or safeguards that you integrate or put into place to ensure that people who are just doing this from the comfort of their own home still have the support that they need. So how did you sort of adjust that for an online environment to ensure that people could go deep and they could have the experience and the release from the issue, but not go so deep or not become so overwhelmed that it was challenging or difficult or disassociative? How did you find that balance in an online environment, knowing that you and the co-facilitator were just on Zoom and everyone was at home, sort of doing their own practice and their own work?
Yeah, so to do a study, you have to go through a university's internal review board and an ethics committee. So I had to do a big ethics report on that. So obviously we had the support of my wife, a trainee psychotherapist. The chair of my PhD committee was a licensed psychotherapist. So they were also available for backup in case someone needed to go speak to someone. We also had a really strong vetting process. So contraindications. So we got, with the informed consent, we had a huge list of contraindications that we had to make sure that people didn't have. So such as, severe mental health issues like borderline, schizophrenia, heart conditions, hypertension, lung conditions, glaucoma, loads, pregnancy, or trying to get pregnant, all these things. So we took out the people who are most at risk. And then even though we had 108 people, we were running 3 classes per week. So we never had more than a 1 to 9 or 10 facilitator to client ratio. And one of the nice things about Zoom is you can create these breakout rooms. So there were times where I would see someone on my Zoom screen and maybe they were like sitting up, they were looking around, they just looked a bit uncomfortable. And then I would say, hey, such and such, I've just opened up a breakout room. Natalia's in there waiting. Can you go speak to them? And then Natalia would be in there to speak to them and help them self-regulate and things like that. And we did have a few negative effects. So one person basically just said they didn't feel safe doing it in the online environment. They felt like it was too overwhelming for them and it was bringing up too much stuff and they didn't feel like they wanted to continue. So they stopped. And then another person similarly, they did this, or like several of the sessions, but they said it made them feel like their stuff was coming up too much and their life circumstances were really precarious and they didn't want to jeopardize things in their life, like their job and their relationship. And it just wasn't the right time for them to go into their apparently quite deep trauma. So we said, best for you to stop. When I wrote about this in the sort of limitations section of my PhD, which can be found on ProQuest if anyone wants to go deeper into it. But we found 5% of people had negative effects, which compared to something like SSRIs, where about 50% of people have negative effects, is far safer. So when the FDA looks at clearing drugs and treatments, they'll balance risk and reward with potency with risk. And obviously, as I said, this is the most potent form of breathwork that I know of. And hence, there are always going to be some trade-offs, some people who get negative side effects, but 5% is extremely low relative to other treatments for mental health. And it's actually the same for talk-based therapy. 5% of people get disassociation and things from talk therapy.
So you've mentioned psychotherapy, talk therapy a few times now. Your wife is about to complete it. You also did some work yourself in psychotherapy, and yet there are also limitations to talk therapy. And so I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about, how can psychotherapy be useful when integrated with breath work, but also what are some of the limitations when it comes to talk therapy that breath work or maybe psychedelics and altered states can help you to sort of work through or integrate that talk therapy alone is just too limited to really support?
Yeah. So I have a postgraduate certificate in psychotherapy, so that is about half a master's. So I'm not a psychotherapist, I'm not licensed, but I spent 2 years thinking I wanted to be a psychotherapist. And during my time writing papers, looking for evidence of how effective it was for treatment, I just kept on getting slapped in the face with really saddening statistics. Firstly, talk therapy for addiction has about an 8% success rate. And then you look at talk-based therapy for depression and anxiety, and it's like a 48% success rate. But then on top of that, you have a 48% relapse rate when we follow up with people at 12 weeks. So that was a meta-analysis from Pim Kuipers. And then a new study just came out a few weeks ago, an Australian study. So it's just one study, it's not a meta-analysis, but they found in talk-based therapy for men, 46% of them drop out before they actually complete the treatment, and 26% of them drop out after just one session. So when you look at the 48% success rate, they're not including the 46% of people who drop out. So this is very unscientific. But if you take that 48% response rate, 48% relapse rate, and 46% dropout rate, you get a success rate for men at least of 13.8% for talk-based therapy on anxiety. So it's pretty low, and I think I concluded at that time when I was doing my master's, like, this just isn't good enough. Like, we deserve better. And at that time, I was discovering psychedelics and breathwork. And I was like, these things have had way more effect for me than talk-based therapy. Why am I wasting my time learning a system that has just such low standards? And why does everyone not know about these low standards? Or why do they just accept these low standards? So that's when I decided to transfer to CIS and do the PhD in transpersonal psychology and conduct that study on CCB. So my wife is a psychotherapist, about to be, and a lot of people be like, you talk a lot of trash about psychotherapy on Instagram and podcasts. What's it like being married to someone like that? And I'm like, well, she agrees. She thinks that we deserve better. That's why she is also the head of online training at a Conscious Connected Breathwork school, Breath Guru. The way I kind of see talk-based therapy is like bread. Talk therapy is a piece of sliced bread. If you give someone a piece of bread, they're going to be like, okay, yeah, I'm starving, that'll do, I'll eat it. But for the average person who's probably, is well fed, a piece of bread is not that appetizing. But if you add to that piece of bread, some salami, some cheese, some mayonnaise, some lettuce, some butter, then that bread becomes quite useful to hold those things together. So I think the talk therapy is the bread, and in the middle is your ayahuasca, it's your breathwork, it's your ketamine-assisted therapies, it's those other more expansive things. And then talk therapy can be good for leading people up to those experiences and then integrating those experiences.
And what is it that breathwork, psychedelics, what is it that altered states bring to the table? What experiences do they provide? What insights do they bring through that talk therapy just can't really touch at this point in time? Yeah,
so altered states. So we know now that conscious connected breathwork can induce altered states akin to small to moderate doses of psychedelics. So there's a study that it's actually a conference paper. It's not actually a peer-reviewed paper, but they put people in an MRI and found that the changes in brain blood flow were to the same extent as a 3-gram dose of psilocybin mushrooms. Wow. And then another study looked at brainwave changes and found, real powerful increases in gamma brainwaves, reductions in beta, and increases in alpha and theta, again, similar to a small to moderate dose of psilocybin mushrooms. Then you have another really cool study by Martha Havenith, and who Robin Carhart Harris is an author of, a very well-known psychedelic researcher. And they did a really cool study where they, every 15 minutes, they checked in with people on the extent of their altered state. So they asked them to put up a finger for 5 of it is I'm completely gone, I'm in another universe. 1 is I feel moderately altered. And obviously if they didn't even respond, they would know they were extremely gone. And so they checked in with those people and found the subjective consciousness alterations were again akin to a moderate dose of psilocybin mushrooms. So we know. So I used to say, like, when I was actually first writing my PhD proposal, I would say conscious connected breathwork induces altered states of consciousness. That's all we know. At that time, we didn't know if they improved mental health outcomes. But I would say there is research from psychedelics and ayahuasca and psilocybin, Imperial, Johns Hopkins, that shows that the extent of altered consciousness and mystical experience predicts how much someone's mental health outcomes improve. Then we had this Martha Havenis study that also found the same thing, that the extent of someone's altered consciousness on their 5 fingers predicted how much of an improvement they would get in their mental health outcomes in follow-up surveys. So what I think is a really key hypothesis is the pivotal mental states hypothesis. Psychedelics interact with the serotonin 5-HT2A receptors and create this hyperplastic state. Marlin Utag has hypothesized that breathwork is doing the same thing. It's creating these pivotal mental states where in talk-based therapy, you can say, oh yeah, I need to, quit smoking, but then you never actually do it. But then when you're in this pivotal mental state, you get this deep whole body knowing of like, oh yeah, I really do need to quit smoking. And then you actually do. So I think it's that the prefrontal cortex, when it's online during talk therapy, it can just inhibit so much growth, and it can really inhibit emotional expression as well. So there's another hypothesis from Reinwein and Williams called transient hypofrontality. So that is basically similar to runner's high and similar to what you get during psychedelics. Is basically the prefrontal cortex gets less blood flow, less oxygen, and the prefrontal cortex, one of its jobs is protecting us from pain, and that includes emotional pain. So let's say you're talking in a therapy session and you're talking about something really sad, you're grieving the loss of a loved one, but you just can't access it. This was the case for me. I'd lost my dad when I was younger, and I just couldn't cry. I talked about it in therapy. I could tell you all the theories, the grief, my attachment styles, but nothing was really changing. I was still depressed and still a mess. But then during Conscious Connected Breathwork, you enter this transiently hypofrontal state where the prefrontal cortex goes offline, and then emotions emerge. Emotions that were suppressed emerge, and people have these, really healing emotional releases through the Conscious Connected Breathwork sessions.
And I'm curious because you touched on it. You were a fitness model for Men's Health. You ran a really successful CrossFit gym in Orange County. To go from that to carrying out the largest randomized controlled trial for Conscious Connected Breathwork for anxiety is quite a shift. What took you into breathwork, into psychedelics, into altered states? What had you go from the identity shift from just focusing maybe explicitly on peak performance to going deeper into the therapeutic realms? And obviously now you're integrating both of those with what you're doing with RUNGA and still with the clinical work, the work that you're doing. But I'm curious, what's your story in getting into this? Why is it that you began to open up to these altered states in many ways?
Yeah, well, a lot of mental health issues from a very young age, from about age 14, really severe depression, anxiety, body dysmorphia, and I guess a kind of hyperfixation on looks and thinking, that's all you need to attract girls. And I was a pretty lonely kid as well, and just felt like, well, if I get into ideal shape, in my mind, it was being on the cover of Men's Health. I'll be happy. I won't be depressed. I won't be lonely. And then, a long journey of about 10 years of obsessing over the gym and nutrition. I got into Men's Health and was supremely happy for maybe a month or two. And then everything just fell apart. I was like, what? I'm depressed again. This can't be. I achieved what society told me you were supposed to do. You're supposed to kind of get a little bit famous and get success and get attention. And I got all those things and was just equally miserable. So then I moved the goalposts. So I was like, okay, yeah, being in Men's Health, because I won a competition, wasn't good enough. I actually needed an agent, and I need paid work, and I need to be a career fitness model. And I got that, I got the agent, and it was during, I was dieting for a photo shoot, another extreme diet where I was getting down into, unhealthy levels of body fat. And I finished the diet and then couldn't stop eating. I just developed, I effectively developed binge eating disorder. And a few things were going on at that time. My job wasn't going very well. I was working in commercial real estate, which was sort of the family business, which I went into just to sort of please everyone else. I'd broken up with a girlfriend, and my dad had died not long from before that. And also I later discovered that I have the DNA for binge eating disorder. There are DNA SNPs that make you susceptible to binge eating. And yeah, I had a real spiral downwards, and thankfully got helped out of that by my ex-girlfriend, and then she put me in touch with an amazing therapist who became more like a mentor, and then he put me onto breath work. I did 12 steps for, Overeaters Anonymous, because for me binge eating was an addiction, and that helped. But it wasn't really until I found ayahuasca and Conscious Connected Breathwork that I was able to become abstinent from that addiction.
Wow, that's powerful. And what was it that you healed through that process? What were some of the insights or some of the sort of tender moments that were real breakthroughs for you in that journey towards wholeness and love and integration?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot there. I think for me, one of the key realizations was like safety, physical, nervous system safety. Like I had a period of like 5 to 10 years where I lost all my support network. Grandparents all died, father died, girlfriend left, and I just realized, oh wow, yeah, you do need connection. You do need people who love you to have your back in an emergency. So ever since I've really pushed the idea of social connection, of community. I also got a dog. I think that was a big thing. Like I have an Australian Shepherd who is just so loyal. I never really had felt that something was so loyal to me, and was looking out for me as well. I think that was a really important thing for me and my nervous system. So yeah, I mean, obviously childhood stuff, nasty events and things like that were healed. But for me, I think the practical steps of focusing on community were absolutely key.
So one of the questions I mentioned, I'll mention this live on the show. I mentioned it to you before we went live, is I love using ChatGPT, and I'll be like, what are 5 to 7 provocative questions? And so I have a couple now that we'll close with and finish with, that I think will give you a chance to maybe riff a little bit in various ways. So the first one is, what do you think mainstream mental health professionals still don't understand about non-ordinary states of consciousness, and what's the cost of that ignorance?
Yeah, well, I've actually just been asked to do a continuing professional development course for psychotherapists in the UK, because I think people in psychotherapy are realizing that, they need to up their game. And I think people don't realize what I said earlier of it doesn't matter about your attachment style. It doesn't matter about your Oedipal complex. It doesn't matter about all these different theories. The key to growth is in talk-based therapy. Basically, there's 3 things, and they call it the dodo effect. Someone did a meta-analysis, basically comparing Freud, Jung, Adler, all these different styles, attachment styles, Winnicott, Bowlby, all these people, to see whether or not one style was better. Because always psychotherapists will be like, oh well, that research was done on CBT, so that's rubbish. My style's much better. So someone did this study and found that actually they all work equally, all work exactly the same, i.e. a little bit. And they found that the consistent things they found that actually worked were just the expectation of benefit, so the placebo effect, reprocessing things with someone who's holding up a mirror. That actually has a benefit. But understanding your attachment style and all this stuff is all like make-believe. None of it is actually real. None of it moves the needle into actual mental health outcomes. So I think so many psychotherapists are just caught up arguing about which style is better, when actually they need a whole foundation shift of we need to be incorporating altered states of consciousness, because that nothing is moving the needle on mental health outcomes like altered states of consciousness.
So you've worked with a lot of modalities, right? And we've talked about those in detail today. You've worked with plant medicines, you've worked with psychotherapy, you've worked with conscious connected breathwork. You've, I'd imagine, done your fair share of biohacking. And so I'm curious, as a practitioner yourself, how would you define your toolkit? Like, what are the maybe 3 to 5 tools that you really rely on or that you bring into a space, whether it's a group space, whether it's a training, whether it's individual work? What are those 3 to 5 tools that you really lean into and rely on to facilitate deep transformation for the clients that you work with or the practitioners that you train?
Yeah, I would say that having a sort of diverse background of, I've studied nutrition at university, I own the CrossFit gym, I've had the psychology degree. I think one of the sort of misunderstandings of psychotherapy is they just pigeonhole everything into, well, we need to talk about this, when so many people's mental health has nothing to do with what they say. It's about what they do in their life. So I often say, if your anxiety and depression is caused by a 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola you're drinking every day, no amount of blaming your parents is going to heal your depression and anxiety. So I really start with the basics. I think the basics are, how is your diet? How inflamed is your diet making you? Because inflammation is a key cause of anxiety and depression. I also think that exercise is such a key thing, and exercise outperforms CBT and SSRIs in almost every study. Community is such a big thing. I've mentioned that already. Like in the UK, there's a minister for loneliness now because they've recognized that loneliness needs a government person to deal with it. And, some studies show that loneliness harms your body as much as smoking a pack of cigarettes per day. So creating community is something we're really trying to focus on at RUNGA, creating a community of like-minded people. Then, of course, we have, what I've kind of identified is like, you can psychoeducate people on, their boundaries and, their issues and things like that. And then you can tell people, this is what you should eat, this is what you shouldn't eat, and you should go to bed on time. But if people can't make those changes, it's irrelevant. That's where the Conscious Connected Breathwork comes in. That's where those pivotal mental states come in. It's like when you combine the psychoeducation with the pivotal mental states, the plastic brain states where people are actually able to make change, then you can see those lasting results. So yeah, my tools are foundational stuff, getting out, getting sunlight, then bringing in the biohacks and the breathwork. The biohacks are more like the cherry on the top. The basics are really what we focus on.
And what my experience has been, and we did a little bit of research around this at Synthesis, which was a legal psilocybin retreat center that I started, is oftentimes to get the train moving, if you will, to create that plastic state in the brain. There may be an initial catalyst that opens someone up to the recognition of, okay, I do need to change these foundational lifestyle practices. So what we have also found, and I'm sure you found this as well, is, folks want to change their diet, or they want to quit smoking, or they want to stop drinking alcohol, or they want to be exercising more. That desire, that awareness is the first step, but the actual cultivating the actual agency to make those changes is the next step. And it feels like with the work that you've done with Conscious Connected Breathwork, what we talk about with psychedelics is we can both start there and continue there, but these deep transformational tools are supportive of the larger goal, which is really, how do you eat better? How do you sleep better? How do you relate better? How do you move more, right? At the end of the day, a lot of it is the basic lifestyle practices. And then, like you said, the cherries on top could be, infrared saunas, or it could be, NAD infusions, or it could be, stem cells and exosomes and peptides. But if those foundational elements aren't really dialed, then a lot of that is just, I think, throwing away money, if you will, at the problem, and not actually dealing with the core cause of what is creating the disease or sickness or whatever it is.
Yeah, big time. And actually, that is the sort of underpinning from an evolutionary perspective of the pivotal mental states. Like the reason we get pivotal mental states is during times of, let's say, famine, the brain needs to go into a really plastic state of like, I can't be in this same routine. We have to move our whole tribe to the other side of the country, or something like that. Or, you lose a loved one, let's say, a tribal leader. That's hugely transformative for how the tribe's going to run. We need to create pivotal mental states where we can actually make changes. And yeah, the benefit of psychedelics and CCB, Conscious Connected Breathwork, is you can go into those states without having to have something, tragic like losing a loved one.
Beautiful. Any final thoughts? Anything we haven't covered yet that you think would be important to communicate or just share with our audience before we close today?
I would say reiterate, the importance of breathwork training and responsible breathwork. And if you are someone who's interested in breathwork, ask for someone's insurance, ask for someone's certification, because there's a lot of people out there who are probably quite desperate and will take risks with your mental health that you don't want to do that. There are really good breathwork training schools. I think I'm a part of one, breathguru.com, if people want to get certified at a really reputable high level. I would say those things.
So folks, if you want to learn more about Richard, richardlblake.com is his website. If you want to learn more about RUNGA, where can folks go to find out about RUNGA, the next event, what's sort of coming up for RUNGA?
Yeah. Well, I'd say the main thing for RUNGA is we're creating this 90-day intensive where we really cover the basics and we integrate that model I've just said of, a lot of psychoeducation, a lot of education around sleep and healthy living and biohacks. And then people get 3 online conscious connected breathwork ceremonies during the course of those 90 days. So if people like that approach, then check out the RUNGA 90-day intensive.
And what's the website for RUNGA? Help me out here.
RUNGA.co.
RUNGA.co, richardlblake.com. Richard's also quite active on Instagram, if I'm not mistaken. What's your Instagram handle?
Yeah, I'm at The Breath Geek.
At The Breath Geek.
That's right.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, so if you have any more questions, go to Instagram, send Richard a DM. I'm sure he'll be happy to point you in the right direction. RUNGA.co, richardlblake.com. Richard, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.